So, episode 10, we've made double figures. Who would have thought it, hey? Yeah, I think it's whizzed by, that's for sure, and we've got into some interesting different topics, so that was good. A little pause week last week.
Yes, yeah. I think we need that. It's okay
Yeah.
to say that, isn't it? I think
Well,
everybody
I mean, it
needs a bit
was
of a pause week.
mainly influenced by my COVID, or not quite COVID, but yeah, cough and
Good.
illness. So
Thought it might come through
apologies
this.
for that. But yeah, back raring to go. So yeah. So topic for today.
Well, we've covered a good few things that are on not the periphery, but like we looked at IDPs, we looked at top tips and mistakes that kind of are those lists, things and things we can do to prepare. So what about practice design? What about thinking about, even if you are doing coaching virtually, which I've had the privilege of watching a couple of virtual sessions in different sports, thinking about maybe on a more simplistic level, the step model, or getting into the nitty gritty of, what things are you doing in your session or not doing that maybe could enhance the productivity and performance level. So what do you think of that?
Sounds good. So you touched upon step. So some people will be familiar, some won't.
Yeah.
Let's unravel that and yeah, let's break it down.
Okay, cool. So let's go with the first one of the S, space. Mindful that we both have a lot of experience in invasion sport. To you, what does space mean when you're thinking about planning your session?
Yeah, I think it brings in lots of different things, really. It's the parameters of somewhere that you might be working, which will influence the things that the people doing the activity will practice. So if you're in a primary school hall, that very much limits and constrains what you can and can't do because of the space that you have, versus if you're in a pitch on a golf course and a swimming pool, it might look something different. So for me, that kind of space starts to dictate the kind of outcomes that you might be able to get from practices.
I love that. And without getting too nitty gritty on it, I think it's nice to think about, well, where does my coaching actually take place? So if the obvious thing is, right, I'm a swimming coach, yes, poolside in the pool, that's my area. But actually, how much starts between the conversations that when they come in the door to the facility, and if parents or someone are collecting, where do they sit, and the balcony or the cafe outside? Now, you're not necessarily coaching in that space, but there's conversations happening. So
that's coaching though, isn't it?
Yeah, well, listen, I'm a big fan of that, but I know there's some people that go, no, I'm on poolside, I have my clipboard, I'm doing this. So I love that and thinking about space, but also, and maybe it's a finer link, but working with some shooting coaches, thinking of where the coach is positioned within that space. So how much space is needed for the athlete to be innovative in that space, for them to go through the different processes that are involved in different shooting disciplines, and when the coach intervenes and when they don't, because like typical sport, other sports typically will have a lot of talking. So from a coach developer point of view, I might suggest maybe observing the silence a little bit more. Whereas when I went to a shooting environment, there was loads of silence. So we talked about the impact of breaking the silence and what kind of questions there would be, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the space and how it's used and how we think of ourselves as a coach being at one with the spaces, lots of different angles on that. Time.
Okay, one more thing on space.
Sorry.
I think it's so as a coach, just be conscious that if you change the space, there's a ripple effect on other things that happen. So if you're playing on a big space or a small space, depending on what kind of game or sport that you do, it will have an impact on the outcomes that different people playing it will get from it. So if you're playing in a small space and you're a little kid, and then the coach goes, right, we're now going to go into a big space, what that little kid could do on a little space might not now be what they can do on a big space, because they're physical maturation and all of those kind of factors start to come into play. And the bigger kids, all of a sudden, may start to dominate practices or games because you're now in a big space, and the returns that they can get because they're physically further ahead are then in their ballpark. So it changes different things that you're looking for. And the technical aspects of what you did in a small space again will then look different in a big space. Yeah. So if it's sending the ball when you're doing a hockey practice, in a small space, a little kid might be able to hit the ball from one side of the pitch to the other and switch the play. But as soon as you then go onto a big area, that changes. Then they don't now have that technical ability to do it because they might be too small. Yeah. So it's just recognizing the complexities of, you can change the space to make it easier or harder depending on the task, but recognize that there's some kind of ripple factors, like chucking a stone in a water. The ripple factors will go out in different ways and affect different people playing the practice in different ways. So just make sure you consider those things and think them through.
Yeah. And another thing that popped into my head as you were saying that is when you're talking about utilizing space and constraining in different ways. A session I went to with the cycling coach, they were really efficient with the space that they had. They obviously had the track, but utilizing different pockets of space around the track for different purposes. And I thought I was just done really effectively. Like they had, changeovers because of the number of kids they had present, and the debriefs were done in certain space. The transition was in a different space. It was just nice to utilize that space, but to also know how effective it can be, maybe for voice traveling, cohesion, a number of different things popping in there. And obviously from the basketball world, that's, really useful. Some coaches tend to stop plays and bring everybody in, waste time, as we talked about, that momentum that you get from the transitions. Come on in, this is my point to correct, when actually it was just, John over there that I needed to have a quick word with. So utilizing and maximizing spaces. Yeah, cool. Really good point there.
So on the step model, I would often use the T for task.
Yes.
So as well as time, how can you change the task and see what different outcomes that creates too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's nicely linked when you have an idea of what you perceive the outcome to be, and then afford, as we hear that word quite a lot now, afford your participants an opportunity to be creative and adaptive with the task. So we talked just there a second ago about space. So constraining that and adding a time constraint onto the task itself. Like it may look completely different to one you did the day before, even though the drill as an overarching maybe title has, we're going to do this. It has, if it's basketball, we've got 2 balls and we're going to get three lines and we're going to try and get this target. All of a sudden, reduce the time, reduce the space, add a couple of balls, reduce the, increase the lines. And they're like, whoa, and they come up with different ways to pass and receive the ball, different ways to move their body, different ways if you add, if it's opposed, then different ways to come around the defender, different angles to move. So yeah, I love that. What does it look like in football?
Well, before I get into football, I'll give you an example from yesterday out on the bike with my 6-year-old son. So where we've got like a block that we can kind of cycle around here. So we went out and he did the block in 7 minutes 40, I think it was.
Okay.
And he was like, and we said right at the start, we're going to do 3 laps.
Yes.
After the first lap, I want to go in now. Right. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm now thinking, right, this is no good for me. Like, so right, I need to be out and a bit more fresh air because I've been indoors all day.
Yeah.
And sometimes he will take the easy option. So I was like, right, that was 7 minutes 40. Do you think we could do it in 7 minutes? And all of a sudden, from being outside the house, literally ready to come in, he was like, yeah, we can do that. So
well done.
Energy level went up. We bombed it round 6 minutes 2 seconds. I mean, it shows how much we dawdled on the first lap. So I was like, okay. And I said, well, we just did it in 6 minutes too. Do you reckon we can get under 6 minutes?
No way.
And he was like, that, definitely. We can definitely do it in 5 minutes 58. I was like, oh, I mean, that's very specific.
Yeah.
But we talked about, because it kind of goes up a bit, big downhill, flat up. So where do we go hard? Where do we go easy? Oh, well, we can roll down the hill. Yeah. And I can save my energy for the last bit uphill.
Oh my God.
All right, cool. So just by playing around with the timepiece and giving ourselves a target, all of a sudden, the energy level goes up, the motivation goes up, and we do 3 laps.
Okay, we're going off here, right? But I absolutely want to take it this direction for a second. So during the week, we had a conversation and we were talking initially about rates of perceived exertion that the coaches were asking their athletes, right? And then someone in that conversation said, well, how closely is that linked to resilience? And are we actually building that? And then how close is that related to some sports where the coaches think if the athlete almost passes out, or you really need to push them till they cry. So I'm getting to it now. I'm getting to the link. And what I think is brilliant about what you've done there is you've given them the opportunity to design it and create the story and the narrative and to gamify it a little bit and the challenge. But you've brought them to a comfortable point of tension and let them decide and release it. So it was, instead of the enforcing, like we have to do a second lap, we have to do this. It's what's going to take to win the championship, blah, blah, blah. Those character conversations. And you've got the results. But I mean, I know it's just a bike ride and fun, but look at the amount of creativity that went into that from him. And enjoyment, and also getting to the next level of what he didn't think he could do 12 minutes earlier. I absolutely love that. And I just think it's so important for coaches to not get caught up in, we must absolutely ruin our athletes. We must break them to get to that point. There's a nice, complementary way of getting to that point of tension with the athlete, of knowing what their boundary and barrier is, releasing it, letting them figure it out for themselves on, how far I can go. And go on that journey together. I know we went off slightly there, but I just think that's absolutely brilliant what you've done. And I think you are so ingrained in that performance space at work and coaching that it probably comes natural, and you're creative and fun as a person. So I think a lot of people can learn from that example.
And maybe the fact that I tied a rope to the front of his bike.
Oh, come on.
Dragged him around by the car. I was in the car. I wasn't on the bike. I was just driving.
Somebody's going to send in a picture. I spotted this man with his kid, and I'd be like, oh no.
Callum in full aero cycling gear. Yeah. Anyway, we digress. Let's go on to E.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
E for equipment. Let's talk about the impact of that.
Oh, sure, listen, the amount of tennis balls I've tried to bring to a swimming pool in the last couple of years, not getting all bells and whistles on it, but the amount of times when I've been, even in my older years, been part of basketball sessions where coaches have just had basketballs in the session and they've had 2 basketballs for 15 or 16 participants. And you're kind of saying, right, okay, here we go. But it's about understanding the impact along, I keep saying creativity and adaptability here, that can come from using different equipment. Now, I guess from thinking of invasion, sometimes when you want to go opposed and you don't have numbers, you might use cones or mannequins and stuff like that. And that in itself can be effective, but it's about looking at what equipment you have, tying in the space and the task time challenge, and seeing how creative people can get. So whether it's a younger age or even older, designing part of the session. So saying, our outcome as coaches based on the last game you had or the last training session you have is for us to work on this particular shot or this particular outcome. But to get to that point, here's some equipment to try. A warm-up game or drill that we used to do. And I think any sport can do this because it was a communication thing. Was we had multiple basketballs, we had tennis balls, we had different texture balls, the reaction ones with the little bobbles. And we'd have a half court space and everybody would have a number and you're passing and moving around nice and easy. It's this kind of, so get to know each other, not get to know each other, but break the day down, let it pass. And we're moving around, chest passing, bounce passing, all these different passes with different balls. And then you say, every second pass needs to be a different ball. And they need to be high and low. So then all of a sudden you're reaching up and you're touching the ground, you're lunging, you're doing all these different things. So that's only a really simple example, but the atmosphere that created, the tone of this that it set for the session, the ability for us to disengage what had just happened when we were outside the gym to this first light touch, but still relatively what would you say, useful for the transition we were going to make into the session. Voices are lifted, the noise of the athletes are taking up most of the space. So it's mindful of the use of equipment that you have that isn't just for your sport. What can you do to bring in a little bit of fun, to add a little bit of challenge? I'll think of more, but tell me what you think. What have you used and come across?
Yeah, I think brilliant. And I think for coaches watching this, in your sport, what can you do to to mix up the experience that the people playing it have? You know, depending on where you are on that kind of journey, you know, if you're, even if you're elite, you still might want to do it. And you know, there was things in the paper from the 2018 World Cup of the England team doing rehab. This is the football team. England doing their rehab recovery session the next day on inflatable unicorns in the swimming pool, having races on inflatable unicorns, playing warm-up games, throwing a rubber chicken about. But you get the same outcomes. You know, it was still a 4v1 and you're moving, but you're just doing it with your hands.
England not playing.
Oh, England are not playing.
Thank you, Siri. She's on the ball as ever.
Oh, yeah.
And they're still doing their recovery.
Yeah.
But they're just doing it in fun and creative ways. And certainly, if you're away, locked up in a hotel for 40 days, which is what they probably would have been linked around that World Cup schedule.
Yeah.
You have to do things to be creative, and recognize certainly at the younger ages, the more different size balls, shapes, etc. you can bring in, the better for multi-skill returns. Yeah. Not just thinking about, well, we play rugby, so just use a rugby ball. Give them different things to catch, certainly the younger age groups, because they might not be very good at catching. So you might need to use something bigger because they might be able to catch it. And just start to think and play around with those ideas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's when I mentioned the swimming pool there, the other thing I was thinking of was hula hoops. So they work on their dive, getting through a hula hoop, certain depth. The paddlers were adding different resistance in the bobbles at the back. I know I can't think of the particular term they use for them now, but putting them at the end of the boat, so when they're paddling, it's causing a little bit of resistance, and you know, just they can have like a really effective impact on what you're trying to do as far as a constraint, but also the fun element that ties in with it as well, something a little bit different. And
I think it's also where you start to get creativity. So from my experience of coaching golf, you know, being around the green for what would normally be a chip or some short game, give them a driver and go, here you go, you know, or 3-iron, right, here you go. How are you going to get the ball on the green? Using this.
Well, that's it.
Start to develop some different shots, and it brings all sorts of different things.
Yeah, and like the last part of that, and we're probably nice transition into the people, is like it's collaborative. Not just with the coach and the athletes that you have, but it's that building trust in the background, but them having a bit of fun with each other. You know, some of the best sessions that I remember being part of, like we still were working really hard, and we were coming up with all different scenarios, but we had that freedom to go and create with a little bit of a constraint. May or may not have used different equipment, but like the difference of using, you know, if you're driving to the basket and you're trying to do a loop pass around a pole versus a pad, or you're going to the basket and there's a pad being used and you're looking at stability and movement. Like it doesn't have to always be the fun stuff that you use, like, you know, the different balls and stuff, but it's just pausing to think about what you do have in the session.
Absolutely.
Anyway, yeah, I think that's definitely worth to look at. And I'm sure looking at the sessions that I've looked at online, fencing sessions in particular, how creative people have gone. Not just
Okay.
coaches. They come back and said, like, I have to do this in my living room. I have to do this in my bedroom. I'm placing my laptop or camera or my phone, whatever, stacked on 2 boxes. I don't have room to have this, so I'm using a water bottle. Like, you know, my target is a pillow. You know, it's really interesting to see how creative people have gotten. So last one on this before we move, people.
Mm.
Yeah. How do you think that, like, what's the consideration of people in your kind of micro planning at the start and your actual practice design?
I think it's changed over time for me. So my my practice design previously with people would have just been, right, this is a 4v2, this is a 3v3.
Mm-hmm.
To right, in this practice we're having boom 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 boom, and that's the defender and that's that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would then, now I think I've probably got a bit more specific and individual with what I'm trying to create.
Yeah.
So definitely a shift in over time, to look at what does an individual need.
Absolutely.
So for example, one kid I used to coach, who's now playing at the top level, elite football, top division, very, very left-footed. So even at under 10, I'm playing him on the right side, but saying that one of the challenges for him is how many times can he go past the defender and cut the ball back from the touchline?
Okay.
Because I'm also working on the centre forward who needs some work on a ball coming towards him and then shooting. So I've got one kid working on his right foot, which is a technical thing that he needed to work on, and a specific shot return that the centre forward needed to work on. And I don't think probably before that I would have even got down to that level of thinking. But these were 9 and 10-year-old kids, so I don't think it's necessarily about the age of the performer. I think it was my lack of ability as a coach before that, probably.
And maybe just the access to information, and the ability of people to share. So maybe it was always there, but I mean, now it's everywhere. There's loads of terminology, loads of examples, and people want to share more. So you're challenged, people are observing, and we have to grow as coaches with that as well. I think that's a really good example of what we were talking about earlier, the block versus random. That's random. Like
tell us block practice.
Yeah. So the opposite of what you just talked about there. So the random practice with variability is having a higher kind of level of thinking for the athlete, and you're kind of changing things up a little bit, and you're making it realistic in this scenario based. Your block practices a lot of repetition, low demand on kind of cognitive ability, so the athletes don't need to really think about stuff. They're just kind of going through the motions of things. So a good example of that would be when you start a training session in basketball and you do layups for 15 minutes unopposed, one ball, or two balls in a long line. And I know everyone can say at some point there's a use for this. So people can say that's the social aspect. They're coming in, they're getting a feel of the ball. But I would say, if you had more balls, give them all out. Everyone getting a touch of something. But instead of adding like that, there's nobody thinking really. You're doing it long spells, and there's not much creativity or variability in it. In football, block practice for you, kind of the same.
Stood opposite somebody, just passing the ball constantly over 10 yards. So it's the same distance, no defenders, no variability. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because then we have our own kind of philosophical view on what we think coaching should look like. And it probably has a place for something. And it might be like returning to play, rehab type work, recovering from an injury. But from a developmental perspective, the returns are probably less. So as coaches, I think in all sports, we should, where needed, we want to develop players that can adapt their skill for the varying conditions that the game creates for them. So in football, and certainly probably in basketball in your world, nothing ever the same happens twice. It just doesn't, because the state of the game has changed. People's energy levels have gone up and down. the speed, the distance, everything is always different. So you're always having to adapt the skill to the needs of what that moment, that specific moment requires. And it wasn't like one before, unless we're talking a closed skill, and it's very, very different. So where possible, increase that variability. So loads of repetition is really important, but with some variability, so it looks different every time.
Yeah. Marianne, who as you and I work with, but Marianne, who we work with, is doing a lot of work and doing her PhD in Skillac, always just says repetition without repetition, Jenny, repetition, you know, we talk and get into the nitty gritty, and she's so passionate about it, but it is that, you know, it's wanting to get the repetition in, but without it being that repetitive kind of, you know, like boring way of like, it's not representative of what's going to happen. And that learning design is then impacted by that unopposed, drooling old way of doing it. But and you throw a couple of things onto that step model, like questioning and positive reinforcement, feedback, and like you're in a great place with your practice design, but thinking about the placing of those, just like we talked about with transitions, so important.
And this is why, you know, we always say that coaching is complex, because there's so many moving parts to it. You know, and back a few episodes ago when we talked about, you know, that initial 10 seconds of trying to catch the people that you're working with and set everything off on a great footing, like that 10 seconds goes badly, like you can have the best session design you've ever had, but makes no difference if all of a sudden your participants are in a very different place. That's why it's hard, right? It's
really hard. Like I had a chat the other day with somebody, and we're talking about that it was about coaching, and it was about people just volunteering. And I had to stop them, and I said, massive thumbs up to people who volunteer, but we got to really prepare them for what they're about to encounter. Like, look at what we've just talked about today and crammed a load of stuff into that short space. But like, that has layers. That step model has layers. And that's a simplistic way of looking at practice design. But you're talking about, like, on top of what you just said there, they need to check in. So you're 10 seconds and 2 minutes. 10 seconds checking in with everybody, your 2 minutes setting up and priming the session, your ability to observe when things need to be differentiated or tweaked, giving the ownership over, having the confidence to co-create or give autonomy to the athletes to creating part of a session, knowing how to observe and tweak, asking the questions and holding the silence, not being afraid if another question comes back to go, I'll get back to you on that, or you know, well, what do you think first and foremost? Making it realistic and representative of, you know, what they're going to face in a competition or that competitive environment. Like, there's so much to consider. And then, you know, the session is moving on. We talk about how long the session should be, the committee, the parents, like, and then we got to the end of the conversation. They were like, wow, that's a job. I'm like, yeah, you know, that volunteer who takes the under 14 team because they're around for a while now has a massive task on their hand, you know, to consider all those. So yeah, but that's why we're doing these kind of things, isn't it? Share.
Absolutely. Brilliant. There we go.
Yeah, wow, time up. Right. At Coach Convo Twitter, lots of people sharing their IDPs, their individual development plan last week, which is fantastic. So keep sharing anything that comes up in this session. It'd be awesome to get your slant on it, and how you plan your session. Do you use a template? Don't you? Do you have certain timings? So that'd be great. At Coach Convo or coachconversation@gmail.com. And yeah, thanks for joining us on 10 episodes. Join us next week for episode 11.
Wow, brilliant.
Have a great week.
Have a great week. Bye.